It was a moonless night when Private William Sykes first heard the whispers in the dark. He was stationed in a remote outpost in the mountains of Afghanistan, far from any base. The isolation was unbearable, but they had a mission, and they couldn't afford to leave. William had heard stories about the place, the ancient ruins nearby, the cursed valley, but he dismissed them. He was a soldier. There was no place for superstition in his life. That night, though, as he stood guard, something changed. The wind howled through the barren landscape, and for a moment, he thought he heard someone calling his name. "Will." The voice said, faint and distant. He spun around, scanning the darkness, but there was no one there. He shook his head, trying to focus. Then, the whispers started again. This time, it was clearer, like someone was right behind him. He turned around, but the space was empty, as it should be. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The voice kept calling, growing louder, almost pleading. He stepped forward, each footfall heavy and deliberate. His weapon was clutched tightly in his hand. The darkness seemed to shift around him, and he could feel something moving in the shadows. He wasn't alone. But the sounds weren't just in his head, they were real. Suddenly, the ground beneath him trembled. The earth rumbled as though something immense was stirring deep below. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. William's heart raced as the whispers turned into screams. They were coming from the ruins. He sprinted toward the source, his instincts taking over. What he found there was beyond his comprehension. A large cavern, hidden beneath the earth, seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Inside, the walls were covered in strange, unfamiliar symbols. The air was thick with the stench of decay and death. It wasn't just a ruin, it was a burial ground. Hundreds of bodies lay scattered across the stone floor, their faces frozen in terror. They had died in agony, and their souls had never left. William's stomach churned, and before he could react, he heard the whispers again. This time, they weren't distant. They were right beside him. He spun around to see the spirits of the dead soldiers, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They reached for him, their skeletal hands grasping at the air. "Join us," one of them whispered, "the war never ends." William fell to his knees, the weight of the spirits pressing down on him. In his final moments, he understood. War doesn't just kill the body, it traps the soul, forever bound to the horrors of the battlefield. The outpost was haunted, not just by the memories of the fallen, but by the very spirit of war itself. And as he joined them in eternal torment, the whispers never stopped. Corporal Jason Harris had always prided himself on being a rational man. He'd been deployed to Iraq during some of the most brutal fighting of the war. The stress was overwhelming, the constant threat of ambushes, the unrelenting heat, and the ever-present fear of death. But in all his time in the desert, he had never seen anything that couldn't be explained. That changed one fateful night during a routine patrol. It was a moonlit night, the air still and heavy. The convoy was making its way through a desolate stretch of desert when their vehicle was ambushed. Gunfire erupted from the darkness, and the soldiers scrambled for cover. Jason's heart raced as he dove behind a pile of sandbags. The firefight lasted for what felt like hours, but when it was over, something was wrong. The enemy had vanished without a trace. There were no bodies, no blood, nothing to suggest that anyone had been there at all. Jason's squad cautiously emerged from their positions, confusion and fear in their eyes. Then, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A battalion of soldiers, dressed in full combat gear, appeared out of nowhere. They were marching toward them, their faces grim and their movements mechanical. The soldiers were all carrying rifles, but there was something off about them. They didn't speak, didn't acknowledge Jason and his men. They just marched past. Jason's first instinct was to call for reinforcements, but his radio was dead. And when he turned to his squad, they were gone. He was alone, surrounded by these silent, ghostly figures. The phantoms marched in perfect formation, heading toward a distant hill. Something inside Jason told him to follow. His legs moved without him thinking. He trailed behind the ghostly soldiers, his breath shallow. They led him to a clearing where an old, abandoned military base stood, long since forgotten by the world. As he entered the base, he was struck by a sense of déjà vu. It looked like a place he had visited before, but the details were all wrong. The walls were cracked, and the air was thick with dust. The phantoms gathered in front of an old hangar, where a door creaked open on its own. Inside, the flickering light of old machinery cast strange shadows on the walls. Jason stepped forward, the cold air biting at his skin. The phantoms were waiting, as if they were expecting him. He took a deep breath and entered the hangar. Inside, he saw something that froze him in place. A massive military helicopter sat on the ground, its blades eerily still. But the helicopter wasn't the most unsettling part. In the cockpit sat a man, his eyes hollow, his face pale and twisted. He turned slowly to face Jason, a cold smile spreading across his lips. "Welcome home," the man said in a voice that echoed through Jason's very soul. "You've been here before, and you'll never leave." Jason's scream was swallowed by the sound of the helicopter's engine starting. And as the phantoms surrounded him, he realized the truth: he wasn't just seeing ghosts. He had become one. In the middle of the Second World War, Sergeant Tom Bennett was assigned to a secret mission deep in the heart of Europe. His unit had been ordered to investigate an old, abandoned bunker that was rumored to have been the site of horrific experiments by the Nazis. The bunker was located in a remote forest, far from any supply routes, and its entrance had been sealed for years. Tom's unit arrived in the dead of night. The air was thick with fog, and the trees whispered in the wind. They approached the bunker cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. As they pried open the heavy steel door, they could smell something foul, a mixture of decay and rust. The inside was cold, damp, and dark, with an oppressive silence that made it feel like the walls were alive. The soldiers entered the bunker, their weapons at the ready. The walls were lined with old, faded documents and strange symbols. There were no signs of life, but the atmosphere felt wrong, like something was watching them. And then, they found it, an old operating room, filled with bloodstains and rusty surgical tools. On the far wall was a large glass container, filled with what looked like human remains. Tom's stomach churned as he examined the contents of the tank. It was the body of a man, but something wasn't right. The skin was stretched and disfigured, the limbs twisted in unnatural angles. The soldiers recoiled, but Tom couldn't look away. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the depths of the bunker, a low, guttural growl. The soldiers turned to find the source of the noise. In the shadows, something moved, a figure, hunched and deformed. It was human, but not human. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, and its skin was stretched tight over bone. The creature hissed and lunged at them, its claws slashing the air. Tom fired his weapon, but the creature was too fast. It struck one of his men, its claws tearing through flesh like paper. The bunker erupted in chaos as the soldiers scrambled for cover. But no matter how many rounds they fired, the creature kept coming, its twisted form nearly impossible to kill. Tom knew they had made a mistake. This place was cursed, no one should have come here. In their greed for information, they had unleashed something far worse than they could have imagined. One by one, the soldiers were picked off, and Tom was left alone in the darkness. He could hear the creature's breath, hot and foul on his neck. When they found him weeks later, Tom was sitting in the corner of the bunker, his eyes wide open in terror. But there was no sign of the creature, no trace of the horrors that had taken place. The bunker had returned to its silence, as though nothing had ever happened. But Tom was never the same. He would never forget the nightmare he had lived through, and he could feel it still, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next victim. These stories are designed to be chilling and disturbing, keeping the listener on edge. Each story breaks at key moments for maximum suspense, with the dark atmosphere of war mixing with supernatural horror. The endings are intended to leave the listener questioning the line between reality and nightmare.